It took just 3 words, and a room of 214 people fell completely silent. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, live, unscripted, and utterly unprepared. The lights were bright, the cameras sharper than ever, and the studio filled with people who thought they were there to be entertained. But what began as just another political broadcast turned into something else, something deeper. One woman spoke a line she thought would win her the crowd. Another woman didn't say a word, at least not right away. And a man in the third row, with silver in his hair and stories buried in his silence, stood up. And in doing so, he rewrote the mood of the entire nation. This wasn't a debate. This was a reckoning. When the joke landed, no one laughed. And when Jasmine Crockett finally spoke, it wasn't with anger. It was with memory, with dignity, and with the kind of stillness that forces people to look at themselves and ask, what does it take to make a nation hold its breath and listen? The answer, as it turns out, begins long before the cameras roll. Because sometimes the most powerful stories don't start with a shout, they start with a stage, and a woman who refuses to play the part written for her. The studio was cold in the way all studios are. Not the kind of cold that seeps into your skin, but the kind that whispers control, calculation, containment. Every light had been calibrated, every camera rehearsed to follow the rhythm of tension and release. American Spotlight was not just a show, it was a production of perception, and today it was live. The audience, 214 people in total, had been filtered through security and signed image release forms, unaware that in less than an hour, they'd become witnesses to a moment they'd never forget. The chairs were padded just enough for comfort, but stiff enough to remind everyone. This was not your living room. Karoline was already backstage, her team brushing lint from her crimson blazer, checking her mic levels for the third time. She smiled like someone who already knew she'd win. To her, this was just another Tuesday, a chance to say something cutting, earn a clip that would be reposted 1,000,000 times, and ride the wave of outrage straight into another podcast booking. She thrived on the edge of controversy and precision, and the producers loved her for it. After all, she brought ratings. Then came Jasmine Crockett. She stepped into the hallway behind the set without entourage, without fanfare. No manager adjusting her collar. No assistant checking Twitter trends. Just her. She wore a fitted black suit, simple, unadorned, deliberate. No jewelry, no bright lipstick, not even the protective armor of a coffee cup in her hand. If Karoline was a flame designed to dazzle, Jasmine was a stone. Quiet, dense, immovable. She greeted the producer with a small nod, then glanced out past the curtain toward the crowd. She didn't wave. She didn't need to. Her eyes scanned the third row briefly, then dropped as if noting something only she could understand. The host rehearsed his opening in a booming voice, all charm and confidence, unaware that today his script wouldn't be the one that held power. The production crew moved like dancers, marking spots, checking focus points, ensuring each guest's best angles were captured. Nothing out of place. Not yet. But Jasmine noticed it. That man, third row, aisle seat, he wasn't clapping when others did. He wasn't adjusting his seat or smiling for the warm-up comedian. He was simply there, upright and still, wearing a gray suit that looked lived in rather than tailored. A small pin on his lapel gleamed under the studio lights. 3 stars, 1 dimmed. He looked like someone who had worn uniforms, seen systems inside out, and long ago learned that silence is the final word when all others fail. Jasmine blinked once, slowly. That man was her father, but no one else knew. And that was how she wanted it. The stage was lit now, the countdown flashing behind the cameras. 5, 4, 3. The red on air sign glowed like a warning. Karoline walked out to applause. Jasmine followed, not slower, not faster, just precisely as she meant to. The contrast was immediate. Karoline waved broadly, flashing that practiced smile as if the cameras were old friends. Jasmine nodded to the audience, eyes forward, focused. To the casual viewer, this was just another panel, another day of political theater. But something in the air had shifted, and if you were paying close attention, you could feel it. like static before lightning. As the host welcomed everyone, Karoline sat poised and animated, already stealing the frame. Jasmine didn't mind. She wasn't here to win airtime. She was here for something else, something even she hadn't named fully yet. And the man in the third row hadn't moved. The conversation began. Karoline spoke first. The script rolled on, but not for long. The first shot was subtle, almost elegant in its construction. Karoline leaned back in her chair with practiced ease, her fingers laced just beneath her chin, giving the illusion of thoughtfulness while her words, sharp as razors wrapped in silk, slid effortlessly across the table. "You know," she began, smiling as if sharing a secret with the nation, "I think part of the problem today is that too many people are being elected not for what they know, but for how they look." The audience laughed. Instinctively at first, the way people laugh when they sense a punchline, even if they haven't processed the meaning. Then came a few claps, a couple of head nods. It was clear that for some in the room, Karoline had just said what they had been thinking all along, but never had the guts to say aloud. The host chuckled awkwardly, unsure if he should let the moment land or quickly move on. He chose silence. A mistake. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't raise an eyebrow. She didn't even shift in her chair. Instead, she let her gaze sweep slowly across the studio, taking in not just the cameras and the flashing red lights, but the people, the audience who had been so eager to laugh, the staff members behind the glass who avoided eye contact, the host who suddenly seemed very aware of the tightness in his collar. And then her eyes landed on him again. Third row, same chair, same stillness. Her father. He wasn't looking at Karoline. He wasn't even looking at Jasmine. He was looking through the moment as if he'd seen it before, 1,000 times in different forms, in different rooms, with different faces saying the same thing, wearing different smiles. Jasmine's breath slowed. Not because she was angry, not because she was hurt, but because she had already done the math. This was going to be one of those days. The kind of day where silence would not be surrender, but strategy. Karoline, emboldened by the ripple of approval, continued. "It's like the media is more interested in optics than outcomes. You know what I mean?" she said, looking out to the audience, who murmured their consent with shallow nods and short chuckles. "Sometimes it feels like some people are handpicked to represent stories, not solutions. Like they're chosen to fit a narrative instead of fix a problem." She wasn't looking at Jasmine when she said it, but she didn't have to. The air had cooled, not dramatically but perceptibly, like the drop in temperature before a storm. Jasmine reached for the pen beside her, not to write, not to take notes, but to touch something that was hers, something grounded, something real. She tapped the pen gently on the table once, then again, and then stilled it. Karoline kept talking. She was in full rhythm now, building a crescendo of confidence, feeding off the flickers of applause that came too easily, too quickly. But something in her smile was starting to look forced. Not everyone was laughing. The laughter, once natural, was now performative, like a show trying to convince itself it's still funny. And Jasmine still said nothing. That silence was beginning to speak, and it was only just starting. It came almost too casually, like an afterthought delivered with a smile. Karoline, riding the momentum of audience approval, leaned forward slightly, voice lowered as if confiding in the nation. "I mean, let's be honest," she said, letting the words settle like bait on the surface of still water. "Some people aren't elected because they're qualified, just because they're the right color." For a second, no one moved. The sentence hovered in the air, delicate and lethal. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't even said with malice. That was the danger of it. It was delivered like a casual truth, a shrug disguised as insight. Karoline even added a soft laugh at the end, as if to say, "You know I'm just kidding." But it didn't land like a joke. Not this time. Jasmine's head turned, slowly. She didn't glare. She didn't smirk. She simply looked out into the audience again, her eyes locking once more on the man in the third row. Her father hadn't shifted. He hadn't blinked. But something in the space between them tightened, as if an invisible cord had been pulled taut. He didn't need to say anything. He never had. That was what made him so dangerous to lies. The studio, so used to laughter and movement and breath, suddenly stilled. The kind of silence that wasn't planned. The kind that didn't come from someone forgetting a line, but from something deeper, like the room itself had recognized something sacred had just been stepped on. The host blinked twice, opened his mouth to pivot, then closed it again. No one quite knew where to look. The cameras, uncertain, panned wide, capturing both women in the same frame, one still smiling faintly, the other not moving at all. Jasmine didn't respond, not with words. She tapped her pen once against the table, then rested her hand flat. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean into the moment. She allowed it to echo, and it did. It moved through the studio, not with force, but with gravity. Viewers at home would later say they felt it through the screen. That subtle internal shift, that moment when a joke became something else entirely. In that echo, you could hear generations. In that stillness, you could sense 1,000 conversations that had been avoided for the sake of civility. The audience began to shift slightly. Posture straightened, arms crossed. A few glances were exchanged. Nervous, uncertain. No one booed. No one clapped. But the moment had passed from entertainment to something far heavier. And still, Jasmine said nothing. Because she knew. She didn't have to answer the insult. The silence already had. It happened so quietly, most people didn't notice it at first. There was no screech of a chair, no dramatic pause in conversation. Just a hand placed on a knee, a small lean forward. And then he rose. Jasmine's father stood up, calm, unmoving, measured in a way that made the very air around him feel heavier, more solid, like his presence had suddenly shifted from background to centerpiece without a single word spoken. He didn't gesture. He didn't raise a brow. He simply stood there in the third row, his shoulders squared, his hands relaxed at his sides, and his gaze, steady, unwavering, pointed directly at Karoline. At first, the host kept talking, filling the air with noise because that's what hosts do when silence becomes uncomfortable. But within seconds, he lost his rhythm. His voice, which moments earlier had projected with charisma and clarity, now cracked subtly on a syllable. Then he faltered mid-sentence, eyes darting toward the audience. That's when he saw him. That's when everyone saw him. Karoline didn't notice right away. She was still smiling, still basking in the strange approval that came from being provocative. But then something shifted. It wasn't anything said. It was the absence of affirmation. The audience, who had been so eager to laugh minutes before, had gone utterly still. No chuckles, no applause, not even polite coughs. It was as if they were waiting for something, or someone. Karoline glanced toward the host, then to Jasmine, still unreadable, still silent, and then her eyes moved toward the audience, scanning until they met him. And when she saw him, really saw him, her smile stalled. Not disappeared, but stalled, like an engine trying to turn over in the cold. She blinked once, twice. Her fingers curled slightly into the chair's armrest. The confidence which moments earlier poured from her in waves began to pull back like the tide before a storm. Because what she saw wasn't just a man. It was history. It was endurance. It was everything her words had pretended didn't exist. He wasn't angry. That was what made it worse. He wasn't shaking his head or narrowing his eyes. He was simply looking. And in that look was a challenge far deeper than any debate stage had ever prepared her for. Do you know who's in this room with you? The cameras didn't cut away. The host didn't speak again. No one did. Because that gaze, silent, grounded, immovable, held the entire room hostage in a truth they could no longer sidestep. Jasmine didn't look at Karoline. She didn't look at the audience. She looked only at him. There was no signal between them, no nod or exchange, just recognition. She had seen this look before, in courtrooms where juries didn't look like the accused, in neighborhood meetings where her father was the only black man in the room, always the one they assumed was angry even when he whispered, in church pews when sermons tiptoed around pain but never named it. It was the look of a man who had lived too long with other people pretending they were the ones uncomfortable. And now, without speaking, without lifting a finger, he had made the entire room uncomfortable. And it was only beginning. As Jasmine sat on that stage, Her eyes fixed on the figure standing in the third row, time began to bend inwards. The sound around her, the hum of studio lights, the awkward rustle of the host's script, even the faint shuffle of the audience, receded into a soft blur. In its place came a memory, sharp and still, as vivid as breath in cold air. She was 9 years old again, sitting in the back seat of their old sedan, watching her father's knuckles tighten around the steering wheel as a white officer asked him for license and registration, with a tone that reeked of superiority, not suspicion. He handed it over without a word. When the officer finally let them go, Jasmine's mother remained silent, but Jasmine couldn't. "Daddy," she asked, her voice trembling with something too raw for her age, "why didn't you get mad?" Her father didn't answer right away. He kept driving for a while, eyes on the road like it held something fragile. Then he said evenly and quietly, "Because I need them to see me whole." She hadn't understood then, not completely, but the weight of those words planted something in her, a tension, a contradiction, a kind of strength that didn't roar, but refused to bend. Years later, she would ask again, in high school, after her father came home from a public meeting where a city official had mistaken him for the janitor. "You just smiled," she said angrily. "You didn't say anything." He had looked at her then, with tired eyes and a gaze full of patience. "They already decided who I am the moment I walked in. If I yell, they feel right. If I stay calm, they have to sit with themselves a little longer." It was only as Jasmine grew older, especially during her law school years, that she began to understand what her father had been doing all along. He wasn't avoiding confrontation. He was mastering it. His silence was not absence, it was precision. He had learned that in rooms built to belittle you, the most radical thing you could do was not become what they expected. When they called him articulate, he thanked them with a nod, never letting them see the sting beneath the compliment. When they made jokes in meetings, thinly veiled under the guise of humor, he would glance at them, not amused, not outraged, just seeing them, making them aware they'd been seen. That's what Jasmine carried with her to every courtroom, every community hall, every debate stage. Her father had taught her that presence could be protest, that restraint wasn't weakness, it was choreography. Every withheld response was a line in a larger story, one where she controlled the tempo. And now, as she sat across from Karoline, whose words had been designed to provoke, to corner, to reduce, Jasmine did what her father had done so many times before. She didn't offer Karoline the satisfaction of a rebuttal. She didn't allow herself to be moved by bait. Because she understood, sometimes power isn't in saying more. It's in holding ground so fully, so completely, that the weight of your being does the speaking for you. Her father was still standing. The room was still watching. And Jasmine, like she had so many times before, was drawing strength from the silence he had spent a lifetime perfecting. Jasmine's hand was resting on the table, still and deliberate. Her father remained standing in the third row, silent and unmoved. The cameras hadn't cut away. The host had stopped pretending to control the moment. Karoline was no longer speaking. Even the crew behind the glass seemed to have forgotten to breathe. And then, without raising her voice, Jasmine spoke. "My father is sitting in this room today," she said. She didn't look at Karoline. She didn't even look at the host. She spoke to the space in front of her, to the people watching live from their homes, to those who'd lived too long inside silences that had cost them more than words ever could. Her voice was calm, not rehearsed. It didn't perform. It remembered. "When I was younger, I once overheard a story he never meant for me to hear. My mother brought it up at dinner, almost in passing. He had just returned from a military base overseas. I asked him why he looked so tired, so withdrawn. He smiled. But she told me later, while he was in another room, that someone on that base, someone he outranked, had looked him in the eye, smiled and said, 'You're the most educated houseboy I've ever met.'" She paused just long enough for the silence to rise again. The audience didn't gasp. They didn't murmur. They didn't move. They just listened. "My father wore the same uniform as the man who said it, served the same country, followed the same chain of command. But still, in that man's eyes, his service, his stripes, his rank, all of it disappeared the moment his skin entered the room. Her voice didn't shake. She wasn't trying to build tension or draw tears. She didn't need to. Every word landed like a stone in a still pond. And so when someone says something like, not qualified, just the right color, maybe you think it's a joke. Maybe you don't mean it that way. But to people like my father, it's not new. It's not clever. It's not even surprising. It's just an old bruise pressed again. Karoline shifted in her chair. The host didn't dare interrupt. Jasmine looked forward, her tone soft but immovable. It's not anger that I carry. It's memory. And memory has a weight you can't laugh away. She said nothing more. She didn't need to. She had spoken the unspeakable not to indict anyone, but to remind everyone. And in doing so, she hadn't argued. She hadn't raised her volume, but she had answered the moment in full. The audience didn't clap, not out of protest, but because they understood, some truths aren't meant to be applauded. They're meant to be carried. Before there were cameras, microphones, and debates watched by millions, there was a classroom with flickering fluorescent lights, a chipped linoleum floor, and a girl named Jasmine Crockett sitting quietly in the second row. Notebook open, eyes alert. She was 12, attending Booker T. Washington Middle School in Dallas, Texas, a public school that, like many across America, carried two realities in one building: the promise of opportunity and the quiet, constant presence of being underestimated. She was the kind of student teachers called well-mannered, when what they meant was invisible. Jasmine didn't talk much in class unless called on. She wasn't loud. She didn't demand space, but she remembered everything. Every time a boy interrupted her and was praised for thinking on his feet. Every time she answered with a measured argument and was told to be more passionate. She noticed the patterns early, the way rules bent for some and hardened for others. In debate club, she spoke calmly, methodically, structuring her points like blueprints. But the judges, mostly volunteers who came in on Thursdays, wanted fire. They wanted volume. They gave points for drama. And so when she lost to a boy who shouted and stumbled, but ended with a punchy line, she asked her teacher afterward, "Didn't I make a stronger case?" Her teacher smiled politely. "You did," she said, "but you need to project more confidence." Jasmine never forgot that. She understood what it really meant. She didn't look like the kind of kid they were used to seeing as a winner. Her confidence was not the kind that filled rooms. It was the kind that held them quietly accountable, and that kind made people uncomfortable. By the time she was 15, Jasmine had started carrying a journal in her backpack, scribbling down quotes she heard on the bus, ideas for essays, even arguments she wanted to try out in mock court. She was beginning to shape herself into someone who could push back, not by shouting, but by showing up smarter, sharper, more unshakable than anyone expected. But nothing prepared her for that October afternoon. It was a school-wide walkout, a protest against new disciplinary rules that disproportionately targeted Black and Latino students, rules that included mandatory suspensions for things like tardiness and disrespectful posture. Jasmine hadn't planned to march. She was still the quiet one, but her best friend Layla had begged her to come. "Just walk. That's all you have to do," she'd said. Jasmine agreed. She thought it would be peaceful, maybe even empowering. It wasn't. They had barely made it to the front of the school when a police officer, one of the three stationed on campus, shoved a student hard against the brick wall. The boy hadn't raised his voice. He had only stepped off the sidewalk. Jasmine watched it happen 10 feet from her. She remembered the sound the kid's backpack made when it hit the ground. She remembered the way Layla's hand froze in hers. But most of all, she remembered the silence that followed. Not just from the students, from the adults, the teachers, the ones who had told them to express yourselves respectfully. None of them said a word. That night, Jasmine went home and asked her father why no one stepped in. He looked at her, not with surprise, but with sorrow. "They were never trained to see us as needing protection," he said. "They were trained to see us as the problem." And in that moment, Jasmine understood. There would be no permission slip for justice. You'd have to take your seat, raise your hand, and speak, even when they tell you your voice isn't the right kind. Especially then. Law school wasn't a decision Jasmine made to impress anyone. It was, in truth, a quiet rebellion against every moment she had been told to sit still, speak softer, be nicer. She didn't go to court to argue. She went to court to reveal, to peel back the polite language of the system and expose the rot beneath its procedures. At first, she believed what many bright students believe, that logic wins, that justice is blind, and that if you speak clearly enough, the truth will rise. It didn't take long for that illusion to fracture. Becoming a public defender was never about prestige. It meant long hours, low pay, and cases that stacked like bricks on a collapsing wall. But Jasmine chose it, chose the mess, chose the clients no one else wanted to defend. She didn't wear flashy suits or carry briefcases polished to perfection. She carried folders packed with receipts, witness statements, notes scribbled at midnight over coffee, and a sense that if she didn't stand beside these people, no one would. Her first year in court was humbling. She lost more cases than she won. Not because she wasn't prepared, but because the rules were never neutral. She'd walk into courtrooms where the prosecutors shook hands with the judges like old classmates, where her clients, mostly young black or brown men, were already seen as trouble before the first file opened. Sometimes it wasn't even about the evidence. It was about tone, about posture, about whether the defendant looked remorseful enough or seemed cooperative. Jasmine quickly learned that justice had a look, and it didn't wear hoodies or have accents or come from single-parent households. But there was one case she never forgot. Marcus Taylor, 17, arrested for armed robbery. The police claimed he matched the description. Black male, gray hoodie, black jeans. That was it. No fingerprints, no weapon recovered, just a description that could have matched half the teenage boys in his neighborhood. When Jasmine met Marcus, he didn't cry. He didn't beg. He just said, "It wasn't me, but I already know that won't matter." She took his case like she took every case, with focus and fire. She pulled records, reviewed street cams, and found footage the police hadn't bothered to check. The boy in the video had tattoos on both arms. Marcus had none. She dug deeper. One of the arresting officers had a history, an unspoken pattern of singling out black teens. Internal memos buried under bureaucratic fog. She unearthed them. She presented them. And the moment she did, the energy in the courtroom changed. The judge didn't thank her. The prosecutor didn't apologize. But Marcus was acquitted. He walked free. But Jasmine didn't feel like she had won, because nothing about that case felt exceptional. It only proved what she feared most, that if she hadn't been there, hadn't gone the extra mile, hadn't pushed when everyone else was content to accept close enough, Marcus would have become another file, another name on a record, another statistic in a system that counts better than it cares. That was the day Jasmine stopped believing in the idea of fairness as a natural outcome. Fairness had to be forced, dragged into the room, held up to the light, defended inch by inch. And if no one was willing to do that for the Marcus Taylors of the world, then she would, even if it broke her piece by piece, because she had already learned that the system wasn't built to break the law. It was built to break people and leave the law untouched. For a long time, Jasmine told herself politics wasn't her path. The courtroom was her battlefield. The law was her weapon. That was where she belonged, or at least that was what she had convinced herself. Elected office felt like theater. Policy debates in glossy halls while real people sat in cold holding cells waiting for someone to remember they existed. Jasmine didn't want the spotlight. She wanted results. But the cases kept coming, and the losses, quiet, invisible, irreversible, kept piling up. Every win felt like sandbags against a dam that was already cracked. The community saw it before she did. It started with murmurs after hearings. "You should run," they'd say, pressing her hand. "You see things no one else sees." She'd laugh politely, brushing it off. "You don't need me up there," she'd reply. "You need me down here." But they persisted. Ministers, teachers, mothers of boys she'd defended. "We don't need someone who speaks loudly. We need someone who sees clearly." That line stuck, not because it flattered her, but because it named something she had always tried to do: see people fully, even when the system only saw files and probabilities. Still, she resisted, until Marcus called. It was late, past midnight, and she picked up, expecting it to be a quick thank you or a check-in. But his voice was different, slower. He told her he'd been stopped again. No charges, no citations, just pulled over, questioned, reminded that he still fit the description. He wasn't calling for help. He was calling to confess something deeper. "You got me out," he said, but nothing really changed. "They're just waiting until they can say I gave them a reason." Jasmine didn't know what to say. And then Marcus asked her, voice barely above a whisper, "If you don't go in there, they'll keep doing this to us, won't they?" She didn't sleep that night, not because of fear, because of clarity, because she had spent years cleaning up the wreckage at the bottom of the cliff, and now she could see the edge of it, where the laws were written, where the budgets were passed, where silence became policy. She could no longer pretend that fighting inside the courtroom was enough if the war was being scripted elsewhere. The next morning she filed. No big announcement, no photo op, just a simple form, signed in black ink, declaring her intent to run. Not because she wanted power, but because she finally understood. Someone had to walk into that room and remind them who was watching. Someone had to carry the silence of her father, the weight of boys like Marcus, the steady fury of communities who had waited long enough. And if no one else would, she would. The room hadn't moved. Not really. The lights still burned from above. The cameras still hummed on their silent tracks. The host still held his cue cards in a trembling hand. But the energy, the unspoken gravity that had slowly shifted over the course of the show, was now no longer subtle. It was visceral. Jasmine sat at the same table, in the same chair, beneath the same lights. But everything had changed. Karoline leaned back slightly now, her smile no longer crisp but stiff, as if the edges had begun to crack under the weight of something she couldn't name. The audience is still silent, watched not like spectators, but like witnesses. They had arrived expecting a debate. What they got was a reckoning. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She turned her head toward the audience, toward the quiet camera suspended like an eye in the ceiling, and spoke with the kind of calm that made people lean in rather than look away. "There's a thing people say sometimes," she began, her tone even, conversational, unforced. "They say I was chosen for how I look, as if that's all it takes, as if everything I've done, every room I've stood in, every moment I didn't flinch, that none of it matters, that I'm a symbol, not a person." She didn't pause for effect. She didn't need to gauge the room. She knew the silence was listening. "But what they forget," she continued, her gaze unwavering, "is who's looking at me. My father, my mother, my students from the neighborhoods no one campaigns in. My clients who were told they weren't worth defending. They're watching, and they know that I didn't walk in through a back door. I pushed the damn door open, and I held it for others." A subtle intake of breath rippled through the audience. Not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable. Jasmine shifted slightly, her posture relaxed, as if she were speaking not to millions on national television, but across a kitchen table to someone who needed to understand. "When people say I was chosen because of my skin, I want them to understand what that skin has carried. It's carried suspicion, it's carried silence, it's carried the burden of being both invisible and too visible all at once." She glanced toward her father, still standing, still silent. His presence was no longer quiet background. It had become the spine of the moment. "And when I speak," Jasmine said, "I don't speak to convince. I speak so that someone else in the room knows they're not alone." Karoline's hand fidgeted near her lap. Her lips parted as if to respond, but nothing came. This wasn't her tempo anymore. The audience no longer looked to her for cues. Her rhythm had broken. Jasmine wasn't playing by her rules. She wasn't defending. She wasn't countering. She was reframing the room. Because truth doesn't shout. It stands. And Jasmine Crockett had stood, not with volume, but with vision. Karoline looked at her, truly looked, and for the first time since the broadcast began, her expression changed, not in defeat, but in something more complicated. She saw Jasmine not as a talking point or an opponent, but as something unshakable, and she knew she was no longer winning. The lights in the studio hadn't dimmed, and yet something about the air felt darker, heavier. not oppressive, but intimate, as though the walls had drawn in to make space for something sacred. Jasmine's voice is still steady, filled that space not with noise but with presence. The kind of presence that demanded nothing and yet made everything else feel suddenly small. The host no longer shuffled his cue cards. He was staring, unsure of whether to intervene or surrender to the moment. Karoline sat still, her mouth a thin line, her gaze no longer directed outward but inward, as if trying to reassemble the certainty that had carried her into the room. Jasmine looked forward, not to the cameras this time, but to the audience itself. She wasn't searching for approval. She was bearing something real, without armor, without defense. "You know," she began softly, "we don't always get to win." She let the words hang in the air, not as an admission of defeat, but as a statement of truth. Not in court, not in debates, not even in the stories told about us. A pause long enough to feel, but not long enough to escape. But we never stopped telling the truth. No one moved. No one dared to. Because that sentence, so simple, so human, stripped the room of pretense. "We keep showing up," Jasmine continued, "even when we know the script wasn't written for us. We sit on panels where we're spoken about in the third person, ask questions that aren't really questions, but warnings." Her tone didn't sharpen. It stayed quiet, almost gentle. "And we still answer. Because silence doesn't always mean submission. Sometimes it means we've seen this all before, and we're waiting to see if this time, someone else is finally ready to listen." The audience had stopped blinking. The woman in the front row had tears in her eyes, but she didn't wipe them. A man in the back had his hands folded, not in judgment, but in something closer to prayer. The studio had transformed. The audience had stopped being spectators. They were witnesses now, not to performance, but to something quietly historic. Not loud, not headline-worthy, but undeniable. Jasmine turned her head slightly, as if sensing the shift in the room, but she never changed her tone. "Some truths don't ask for applause," she said. "They ask for reflection. And I've learned that if you speak those truths long enough, through court losses, through jokes, through silence, eventually someone hears it differently." The cameras were still rolling, but no one would later remember how the segment was framed. What they would remember was how the room had changed, not with argument, not with heat, but with something far more powerful: clarity. Jasmine leaned back, not in triumph, but in stillness. And Karoline, once so fluent in rhetoric, so commanding in the spotlight, looked at her not with resentment, but with something that flickered closer to respect, or maybe realization. Because in that moment, it became clear. This wasn't about political sides. It wasn't about who had the sharper words or the better soundbite. It was about truth, uncompromising, unpackaged, unavoidable. And Jasmine, without raising her voice, had just made everyone in that room, on stage, behind the camera, and in living rooms across the country, feel it. He moved with the same grace he had held for the last 10 minutes, as if time itself bowed to the rhythm of his intention. No flourish, no dramatics, just a slow bend at the knees, one hand braced gently against the back of the chair, the other steadying his weight on the armrest. The fabric of his suit whispered against the vinyl as he eased himself down, spine still upright, eyes still forward. Jasmine's father had stood without a word, and now, without a single command, he sat back down. But nothing in the room returned to how it had been. There was still no applause, no music cued, no cue card telling the audience to smile, and yet something deep in the studio, something invisible but undeniable, shifted, like the release of tension in a wire stretched too tight, like breath after a held silence. The host, normally a master of transitions, didn't speak. His fingers gripped his notes, but his eyes weren't reading. Karoline, for her part, had gone completely still. Her gaze, once sharp and active, now fell downward, toward her lap, the edge of the table. Anywhere but Jasmine's face or the man who had just sat down. Her shoulders, once held high with confidence, had dropped slightly. She wasn't defeated, but she was no longer present in the way she had been. Something had disarmed her, not with force, but with stillness. Jasmine remained composed, though a subtle shift passed through her expression. Something gentle, almost imperceptible, like the end of an exhale after a long-held breath. She didn't look at her father. She didn't need to. His act of standing had never been for her. It had been for the room, for the moment, for the line that had been crossed and needed no speech to be redrawn. The studio lights seemed to dim, not literally but emotionally. The brightness that once spotlighted performance had softened, as if even the environment understood this wasn't about drama, it was about recognition, reckoning, reflection. Karoline didn't speak again. She didn't offer a defense. She didn't clarify her intent. In that silence, her words had already begun to shrink, not because someone tore them apart, but because they simply could not hold their shape under the weight of what followed. No one had shouted her down. No one had demanded an apology. The moment had turned not by confrontation, but by clarity. And in that clarity, there was no room left for the smirk, the shrug, the deflection. Everyone stayed seated, not because the show was over, but because something real had taken its place. And the truth, once it had entered the room, required no introduction, no applause, no permission to stay. It simply sat down with them and would not leave. When the episode aired in full later that night, there was no digital eruption, no trending hashtags, no viral takedowns or immediate panels dissecting every second. Instead, something quieter happened. People watched, and then people watched again. It wasn't outrage that spread, it was replays. Long, uninterrupted replays where users didn't cut the clip or add their own commentary. They just posted it as it was, as if tampering with it would somehow diminish its weight. And slowly, hour by hour, the views climbed, not in sudden spikes, but in steady, deliberate rhythm, like a whisper traveling farther than a scream ever could. The first comment that began to catch fire was just a single line, posted under one of the earliest uploads of the clip. He stood up, and we never saw her the same again. No hashtags, no emojis, just that, and it was enough. Within hours, the line was reposted on Instagram stories, turned into black and white text on Twitter, scribbled into notebooks and journals, even printed and taped onto walls in places far from any television set. It wasn't a slogan. It was a shift, put into words. Soon after, a high school teacher in Chicago assigned the clip to her civics class. No worksheet, no quiz, just a handwritten prompt given out the next morning. What makes a man powerful without speaking? The essays that came back surprised her. One student, usually quiet, wrote, "Because silence can't be debated, only felt." Another scrawled in looping blue ink, "He reminded me of my grandfather, who survived Vietnam and segregation and still opens doors for people who avoid eye contact." A third, only 16, submitted a single sentence. "Power is not always the one who speaks. It's the one who makes others rethink what they just said." There was no single platform that claimed the moment. It spread in pieces, on Reddit threads titled "The Moment Silence Became Justice," in private Facebook groups of teachers and clergy, in YouTube comment sections where users, for once, didn't argue. Instead, they told their own stories, of fathers who never raised their voices, of moments they wished they had sat down instead of spoken, of jokes they now heard differently. Jasmine didn't go online that night. She didn't issue a statement. No press team followed up. But the clip had already escaped into the bloodstream of American conscience. Not through manipulation or rage, but through clarity. Even the late-night comedy shows known for turning every political moment into satire held back. One host reserved the final 60 seconds of his program not for a monologue, but for the raw footage of Jasmine's father standing, holding the room, and then sitting down. No music, no voiceover, just the clip, and then silence. At a community college in New Mexico, a group of social justice students gathered to analyze the event. The professor didn't lead. He played the clip twice, then asked, "What did you feel?" Not "what did you think," but feel. A girl in the back said, "It felt like someone finally said what no one dared to say, but he didn't need words." For once, the internet didn't rush to interpret or twist. It paused, and in that pause, something rare happened. People started listening, not for the next headline, but for the echo that remained. Jasmine didn't schedule interviews. She didn't appear on the morning shows or book a late-night segment to capitalize on what the internet had begun to call the moment. Her inbox was flooded with requests, anchors wanting sound bites, influencers offering collaborations, producers pitching documentaries. She declined them all, not out of indifference but out of respect. Some truths, she believed, lose their power the moment they're repackaged for attention. What had happened on that stage wasn't content. It was consequence. And she wouldn't dilute it. But not everyone stayed quiet. The photo appeared 3 days later without warning. It wasn't a press release. It wasn't taken by a professional. It was grainy, slightly out of focus. But the image said everything. Jasmine's father, still in his gray suit, was sitting alone backstage after the taping. His hands rested gently on his knees. He wasn't checking a phone. He wasn't speaking to anyone. He was simply sitting, the soft hallway light casting a golden hue on the silver of his hair, his shoulders slightly curved. Not from fatigue, but from the kind of stillness that comes after doing exactly what needed to be done. No one knew who took the photo. It was first uploaded to a small Instagram page belonging to a student journalist. The caption was short. He didn't need to be believed. He just needed to be seen. That line, simple, quiet, became something larger than the post itself. It was shared by school teachers, printed out and pinned to office corkboards, quoted in sermons, even painted on a mural wall in a community center in Baltimore. Somehow, people recognized it as a permission slip for stillness, for dignity, for being enough without explanation. Meanwhile, Karoline disappeared. No statements, no tweets, no public defenses or clarifications. Her team said she was taking time to reflect, which the media interpreted in every direction. Damage control, guilt, calculation. But Jasmine said nothing about her, didn't shame her, didn't correct her. She didn't need to. The echo had already done the work. 2 weeks later, Karoline resurfaced, not with a press conference, but on a small podcast hosted by a retired journalist known for slow, human conversations. The episode was titled simply, What We Don't Say. Halfway through, after discussing unrelated topics with stiff, controlled energy, the host gently asked, "Is there anything from this year you regret?" Karoline paused. 3 seconds passed. Then she said, almost inaudibly, "I wish I'd known who was in the room." She didn't elaborate. She didn't name Jasmine. But she didn't need to. The words hung there, softer than an apology but heavier than deflection. It wasn't confession. It was awareness. Arriving late, but arriving nonetheless. The clip didn't go viral. There were no headlines. But people shared it, quietly, with comments like, "Sometimes that's all it takes." Or, "Maybe she's listening now." For Jasmine, it was never about a takedown. She hadn't spoken to win. She had spoken so the truth would stop being so lonely. And now, even the one who had tried to dismiss her worth had felt something shift. Not through shame, but through seeing. And that kind of change, slow, quiet, without fanfare, is the kind that stays. It began where most real change does. Not in headlines or viral charts, but in quiet corners where people gather to reflect, to wrestle, and to remember. In a small church in Mississippi, the pastor stood before his congregation one Sunday morning, Bible in one hand, a printed screenshot of Jasmine's father in the other. He didn't preach fire and brimstone. He didn't call for protest. He simply looked at the photo, then out at his congregation and said, "Faith doesn't always come from the one who speaks the loudest. Sometimes it comes from the one who simply stands and makes you want to be better." That week, 3 more churches in different states referenced the same moment in their sermons. One in Detroit, one in Raleigh, one in Fresno. No coordination, just resonance. The kind of collective understanding that doesn't need planning to take root. He'd written months ago, a joke meant to lighten the mood. Something about how people were too quick to be offended these days. He stared at the sentence longer than usual. Then with one keystroke, he deleted it. He didn't explain the change. He just knew it no longer belonged. In high school auditoriums and faculty lounges, the phrase, "just a joke," started to lose its protective shell. Teachers corrected themselves mid-sentence. Students caught themselves before parroting lines they'd heard online. In one classroom in Phoenix, a student paused after making a quip, then looked around and muttered, "Never mind, that's not funny anymore." His friends didn't mock him. They just nodded. Even workplace trainings, those long, scripted modules on diversity, began to shift. HR directors replaced sections about sensitivity with conversations about responsibility, about awareness, about presence. They played the clip, not as a warning, but as a mirror. Somewhere, a mother who once told her child to toughen up when facing teasing about race sat in her car after work, replaying Jasmine's speech for the third time. She didn't cry. She didn't post. But she did something she hadn't done before. She called her son and said, "Tell me what that joke felt like when they said it. I'm listening." Change didn't thunder through the streets. It moved like water, slow, steady, reshaping everything it touched. And across America, people didn't stop making jokes. They just stopped pretending the impact didn't matter. In the weeks that followed, while the world turned its attention to newer headlines and louder distractions, Jasmine Crockett went back to work. Not in front of cameras or on polished panels, but behind closed doors, in long policy meetings, in cluttered offices filled with drafts, reports, and late-night coffee. She didn't wear the moment from the show like a badge. She didn't reference it in speeches. She never even said the words "that day." But those who worked closest to her noticed something had changed. It showed up in her pauses, in the way she now let silence stretch a little longer before she spoke, especially when someone else was still trying to find their words. In the way she stopped interrupting junior staffers mid-sentence, instead letting them finish even when she already knew the point they were making. In the way she circled back to concerns she might have brushed aside before, not because she had to, but because she had started to understand that being right wasn't enough if the room didn't feel heard. But more than anything, it showed up in the legislation she began to shape. Jasmine had long planned to take on police accountability. It was why she had run. But now her approach was different. Less about symbolic gestures, more about the infrastructure of harm. She began by assembling a quiet task force of legal scholars, community organizers, former officers, and public defenders. She asked them hard questions and let their answers linger. She studied policy failures from the last 2 decades and pinpointed the cracks where injustice didn't scream, but seeped in silently. Her draft bill was dense, not flashy. It didn't have a catchy name, but inside it was the weight of experience. It proposed independent civilian review boards with real teeth, not just advisory power. It mandated body cam footage to be publicly accessible within a fixed window, without loopholes. It introduced language around intentional de-escalation culture, funding training not just in tactics, but in bias interruption, forcing departments to reckon with who they see as a threat before they ever draw a weapon. She never once referenced her father in the language, but he was in every line. The man who stood without words, who made a room pause without raising a voice, now lived in the phrasing she chose: measured, precise, undeniable. When a colleague suggested naming the bill after him, she declined. "This bill isn't about a name," she said. "It's about making sure someone like him never has to stand again just to be seen." Staffers noticed she worked longer hours now, but complained less, that she read more transcripts than ever before, especially testimonies from families who'd lost someone in silence. Without footage, without fanfare. She treated each one like it mattered, because to her it did. And even when her team urged her to speak about the show, to use that moment as a lever for support, she shook her head. "If the truth needs a reminder," she said, "it didn't really land the first time." Her father never commented on the bill. But when she sent him the first full draft, he wrote back a single sentence: "This feels like something I can finally put down." Jasmine didn't frame the message. She folded it quietly and slid it into the pocket of her notebook, because the work wasn't done, but it was finally beginning in the right place. The email came with a subject line in bold, all caps: "You are our moment." A glossy political magazine, known for its sharp profiles and power rank lists, wanted Jasmine for their next cover. The concept was already mapped out: bright lighting, neutral background, a tailored black blazer over a crisp white blouse. The cover line: The Woman Who Silenced the Room. There would be an in-depth feature, a digital rollout, a televised interview to accompany the spread. Her team was excited. This could cement your platform, one advisor said. This isn't just influence, it's identity. But Jasmine only skimmed the pitch before closing her laptop. She sat with the offer for 2 days, not because she was tempted, but because she wanted to understand what it was that unsettled her about it. And then she realized it was the word moment, as if what happened on that stage was a product, a packaged, consumable, emotionally curated spectacle meant to orbit around her face. But it wasn't her face that changed the room. It wasn't her voice that made people rethink their words. It was silence. It was her father. It was history, unpolished and unspoken, finally standing in plain view. She hadn't crafted that moment. She had simply refused to step around it. She declined the cover. No dramatic statement, just a polite message. I'm not the story, that silence is. And then she went back to work. That same week, a letter arrived at her office, handwritten in pink ink on lined notebook paper. No return address, just the first name, Aaliyah, age 14. The letter was short, only 3 sentences. My teacher showed us the video. They laughed at me once when I raised my hand and used a word they didn't know. I almost never spoke again. But because of you, I know not to shrink when they laugh. Jasmine read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and slid it into the same notebook pocket where her father's message rested. There were no camera crews when she answered Aaliyah's letter. No press release. She didn't tweet about it. She simply wrote back in her own handwriting, "They laugh because they didn't recognize the sound of your strength. Speak again, speak often." Later, during a closed-door planning session, her communications advisor suggested revisiting the idea of platform building, branding, personal messaging. "It's the moment to capture hearts," he said. "Let's build your image around courage." Jasmine shook her head. "Courage," she replied, "doesn't ask to be seen. It survives long enough to see itself in someone else." What Jasmine understood, and what so many failed to grasp, was that power didn't come from being photographed in your strongest pose. It came from choosing not to pose at all, from letting someone else carry the story forward, from making sure girls like Aaliyah didn't feel like footnotes in rooms they belonged to from the start. She didn't need her face on a cover. She needed her silence to keep echoing in classrooms, courtrooms, kitchen tables, and quiet corners where someone doubted they were enough. And if that echo ever needed a name, it wouldn't be hers. It would be theirs. Jasmine never saw herself as a mentor. She had always been the one fighting, not guiding. But as the months passed, more and more young people started showing up, sometimes with resumes, sometimes with notebooks, and sometimes just with questions too big to ask anyone else. They didn't come for selfies or sound bites. They came because they had seen something in her, not just a woman who had stood firm, but someone who had allowed stillness to matter. And they wanted to know, how do you stay upright when the world keeps trying to twist your spine? She didn't offer speeches. She offered time. Office hours were no longer just for policy briefings or media prep. They became something else. One-on-ones over lukewarm coffee, walk and talks down long Capitol hallways, occasional moments of silence where answers didn't come easy, and Jasmine simply nodded and said, "That's a good question. Sit with it." Her staff began calling it the quiet mentorship. It wasn't flashy, it didn't get posted, but it left an imprint. One afternoon, after a long meeting with a visiting delegation, she found herself in the break room with Lan, a Vietnamese-American intern in her early 20s, who had mostly kept to herself. Jasmine was pouring tea when Lan spoke, softly, as if afraid the words might sound foolish when said aloud. "I just wanted to say, your father reminded me of mine." Jasmine paused, teacup in hand, then turned. Lan wasn't looking for praise. Her voice carried something deeper, something remembered. "When I was little," Lan continued, "my dad never yelled. Not once. Not even when things were bad. He just stood still. And sometimes I thought that meant he wasn't fighting. But when I saw your father that day, I realized maybe he was." Jasmine didn't answer right away. She let the words settle, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she wanted Lon to feel how much they meant. Then she smiled. Not wide, not performative, just enough. That means, Jasmine said gently, we're doing it right. Lon nodded, and they stood there a moment longer, not as congresswoman and intern, but as daughters who had inherited something unspoken and now understood it together. Later that night, Jasmine wrote one line in her notebook, just beneath the folded letters she carried with her from her father and Aaliyah. When our silence helps someone else find their voice, then it was never silence at all. She closed the notebook, turned off the lights, and left the office with no cameras waiting outside. The work would continue tomorrow, but tonight she knew. The voice of the future wasn't hers. It was already learning how to speak. A year later, the studio was quiet. No lights humming, no stage manager with a headset, no laughter from the audience or hurried movement from camera crews. Just silence, thick and unbothered, resting on every surface like dust. The same chairs were still lined up beneath the cool fluorescent lights, the same table still marked faintly with water rings and pen scratches. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Jasmine walked slowly across the studio floor. No one accompanied her, no photographer, no aide. She had asked to be let in early, before the day's programming began, before the room turned into spectacle again. Just 15 minutes, alone. The crew obliged without questions. She moved deliberately, each step a quiet echo in the hollow space. Her heels clicked gently across the polished floor until she reached the third row. Aisle seat. She didn't sit. She just stood there looking down at it for a moment. The chair was still slightly misaligned from the others, almost imperceptibly off-center, like it remembered who had been there. Jasmine closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, she was already moving again. She walked toward the stage, the table, the two chairs still set in their usual configuration. She didn't take her seat. Instead, she kept walking until she reached the edge of the platform and turned, until she was facing the exact spot where her father had stood. She didn't cry, didn't pose. She just stood still for a while, staring into the same rows he had faced, now empty, now silent. And then, almost without realizing it, she whispered, not to the room, not to the past, but to him. You changed the room, she said softly, and no one noticed at first. She paused, breath slow, voice barely audible. That's the power. Her words didn't echo, but they didn't need to. They hung there, suspended in the stillness, like light through dust, visible only if you looked closely enough. She thought about that day, not the clip, not the headlines or the retellings, but the moment before it broke wide open, the breath she took before speaking, the glance she gave her father, not for permission, but for grounding, and how, when he rose, the air thickened, not with tension, but with recognition. She thought about all the rooms she had entered since, congressional hearings, town halls, classrooms and courtrooms, how each one carried a different kind of weight now, not because of who she was, but because of what she carried with her, his stillness, his strength, his refusal to flinch. Jasmine didn't stay long. She wasn't there for nostalgia. She was there to mark something, silently, inwardly, to acknowledge that not all lines are drawn with ink. Some are drawn with presence, and some, like the one her father had drawn by standing, changed the shape of the entire room without needing to be spoken aloud. Before she left, she ran her fingers lightly across the edge of the table. The wood felt the same, cool, familiar, real. Then she turned and walked out. No applause, no audience. But something stayed behind with her footprints, quiet proof that the line had been crossed, not in anger or spectacle, but in quiet resolve. And once it had been crossed, it could never be unseen. They came one by one. Some wore crisp suits, others carried spiral-bound notebooks with tabs sticking out like feathers. Some had Ivy League degrees, others came from grassroots movements where the only resume that mattered was showing up for your community again and again. But they all carried the same answer when asked, "What made you decide to run?" And more than a few of them said her name. Because of what she didn't say, one candidate wrote in her campaign bio, because silence can sometimes be the loudest promise. Jasmine never asked for the credit. She never stood beside them at rallies or posed in endorsement photos, but she heard about it. Through friends, through staffers, through folded letters left on her desk with handwriting both messy and proud. One newly elected representative from Colorado, just 27 years old, quoted her in his first speech, "We don't always get to win, but we never stop telling the truth." He paused after the sentence, looked across the chamber, and then said, "Some truths are still sitting in the third row, waiting to be seen." That line landed, not with applause, but with stillness. And stillness by now had become its own kind of authority. In another hearing, ordinary on the surface, buried in budget amendments and procedural language, a congressman began to speak. Middle-aged, seasoned, known for his dry wit and occasional barbs that tiptoed just close enough to the edge to get a laugh. He leaned forward, index finger tapping the desk, preparing to make a joke about overcorrection and sensitivity these days. His mouth opened. Then he paused. 3 seconds. Then he cleared his throat, shifted his language, and simply moved on. No one commented. No one praised him for it. But someone noticed. One of Jasmine's staffers, watching from the corner of the room, scribbled a quiet note into her notebook. Sometimes progress is the joke that doesn't get told. That was how it moved now. Not always in bold declarations, but in restraint. In the space between impulse and intention. In the choice not to say what used to be said with a shrug. And in that space, Jasmine had come to see the true shape of legacy. It wasn't measured in headlines. It wasn't even measured in policy, though she remained relentless in pushing her bills, her reforms, her demands for transparency and change. Legacy, she realized, lived in culture, in reflex, in what a room no longer found amusing, in what no longer passed as harmless. That was the line her father had helped draw, not by opposing the old script, but by making it too small to contain the truth. She saw it in how debates now opened with acknowledgement, not defensiveness, in how young staffers leaned in, not out, when issues of race, identity, and power surfaced, in how silence, once used to dismiss, was now respected as a pause worth listening to. No monuments were built, no laws were named after him, but somewhere between the unsaid and the unshouted, a new kind of progress took root, the kind you don't notice until you realize what hasn't happened, and how much strength it took for someone, somewhere, to stop it from happening again. The marble steps of the Capitol were slick with frost as Jasmine descended them slowly, her breath curling in the crisp DC air like questions left unanswered. The sun had not yet fully risen, and the city was still cloaked in that peculiar quiet of early morning, before the horns, before the headlines. She had just finished a long night session, the kind that left her with more questions than votes, but somehow she didn't feel tired. Not in the usual way. She didn't wear a coat, just a thick black blazer wrapped close and steady. Her heels struck the stone softly, rhythmically, each step measured not for effect, but for balance. Her hands were bare, tucked into her pockets not to hide, but to ground herself. The building behind her stood tall and impassive, the same way it had for generations, its pillars proud, its windows blind. But today, Jasmine didn't look back at it. She walked forward. The sidewalk ahead was empty. The world hadn't caught up yet, but in that stillness, she allowed herself a small thought. Maybe this is what legacy looks like. Not fireworks, not ovations, but walking into the cold with your head up, knowing the ground is just a little firmer because you stood still when it mattered. As she reached the end of the block, the faintest echo followed her. Not loud, not scripted, just memory made movement. A soft second set of footsteps. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. They weren't real, not in the literal sense, but they were real enough, the same way her father's silence had once filled an entire studio, the same way his gaze had stopped time without raising a single objection. She could feel him now, walking beside her, not guiding, not protecting, just being there, as he always had, as he always would. And then, as if the world itself had been waiting, a single voice layered gently over the ambient sound. Not her father's, not the host's, not a narrator. Her own, quiet, sure, timeless. Some things aren't meant to go viral, a pause, light but full. They're meant to go deep. The screen would fade soon. The image would dissolve into soft white light, the city just beginning to stir, a woman in black disappearing into its rhythm. But before it did, the sound would linger. Two sets of footsteps, soft even, falling into sync. No credits, no logo, just the echo of presence. A father, a daughter, a silence that stayed, and a room that would never be the same again. And perhaps that is what true change feels like. Not the eruption of applause, nor the blinding light of attention, but the quiet recognition that we are no longer the same as we were before. That a word left unsaid, a joke left untold, a presence left unshaken, can do more than any rallying cry ever could. This was never a story about politics. It was never about who won a debate or who lost the room. It was a story about the lines we carry, the ones drawn for us, the ones we inherit, and the ones we choose to draw when no one else will. Jasmine Crockett did not raise her voice to be heard. She carried the silence of generations and made the world listen, not with volume, but with vision. Her father did not stand to protest. He stood to remind us that dignity does not demand attention. It commands it. He taught us that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is to remain exactly where they are and make others shift around them. And through them, we are reminded that progress is not always loud. Sometimes it speaks in restraint. Sometimes it shows up when someone chooses not to laugh, not to clap, not to explain, and simply chooses to see. This narrative is shared in the spirit of reflection and storytelling. Any resemblance to actual events or persons is purely interpretative and intended to invite dialogue, not judgment. The goal is not to condemn, but to contemplate. Because in a world that often rewards those who speak first and loudest, may we never forget the rare, transformative power of those who choose instead to stand. Even if only for a moment, even if only once, even if no one noticed at first. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.